The earth trembled beneath her bare feet. That's what the slaves whispered when she walked past the fields at dawn, that the ground itself feared her. She was taller than any man, stronger than any whip, and quieter than the grave. They called her Goliath's daughter, because to name her was to summon something too powerful, too dangerous, too divine to be human. She was born in 1812 on a Louisiana plantation that thrived on cotton and cruelty. The day she entered this world, her mother died, and her cries echoed through the wooden cabins like thunder. From the very beginning, she was treated as an omen, a bad sign wrapped in human form. The overseer spat when he saw her, muttering that no good comes from a child born taller than Mercy. By the time she was 12, she could outlift grown men. By 16, she was nearly 7 feet tall, with hands big enough to crush cane stalks with a single squeeze. But she didn't speak. No one ever heard her voice. Some said she was mute. Others said she refused to speak because the only language she wanted to use was power. The plantation master, Colonel Wade Harper, was fascinated by her. A man with wealth, arrogance, and a cruel imagination, he saw her as a possession, a freak to control, a symbol of his dominion over nature itself. He called her his iron angel, and he made her perform for guests. She lifted barrels, bent iron, carried livestock on her shoulders. To him, she was not a woman. She was a beast in a dress, a living trophy of his power. But the real fear wasn't in her strength, it was in her silence. No matter what Harper did, no matter how loud his commands, how sharp his whip, she never screamed, never cried, never looked afraid. She just stared, her dark eyes steady and unflinching, like she was studying a man already dead. The slaves learned to look away when Harper approached her. They knew the cruelty he inflicted. They knew the horrors that took place behind the locked doors of his mansion. And still, she endured it all in silence, waiting, watching, biding her time. Whispers began to spread across the fields. Some said she was not born of flesh, but of vengeance, that her father was not human, that he was Goliath himself, the fallen giant from the Bible, reborn to avenge the enslaved. Others claimed she carried the strength of every beaten back and broken soul on that land. Whatever the truth, even the overseers stopped meeting her eyes. There was something in her gaze that made even the cruelest men tremble. Then came the night of the red moon. The air was thick, the swamp alive with the cries of frogs and the hum of unseen things. Harper, drunk and raving, dragged her from the quarters to the big house. No one knows what happened behind those doors, but what followed was the sound of shattering glass, breaking wood, and a single scream, not of fear but of rage. When the morning came, Harper was dead, his skull crushed like a melon, his blood stained the parlor floorboards, and Goliath's daughter was gone. They hunted for her for weeks. Dogs refused to follow her scent. Men swore they saw her shadow moving through the fog of the bayou, carrying something heavy over her shoulder. A chain, or perhaps the weight of freedom itself. Years passed, but her legend only grew. Some claimed she freed runaways and led them north through hidden swamp trails. Others believed she still roamed the night, a giant spirit cloaked in mist, punishing the wicked who dared to harm the helpless. No one ever found her body, but in 1920, long after her name had faded from the records, a hunter discovered a small shack deep in the Louisiana swamps. Inside lay bones larger than any man's, and around them, a rusted chain engraved with 2 letters, GD. They said it stood for Goliath's daughter, but maybe it stood for God's deliverance. She came into the world on a night when the air itself felt heavy, as if the bayou was holding its breath. The year was 1812, and thunder rolled above the Louisiana Delta like distant cannon fire. Inside a rough wooden cabin behind the main plantation house, a woman named Hester screamed once, then went silent forever. The midwives said the baby came out larger than any child they had ever seen, her skin shining with sweat and her fists already clenched tight. They wrapped her in a scrap of linen and laid her beside her mother's body. One of the older women crossed herself and whispered, "This one ain't born right. She's touched by something bigger than us." From that night on, the whispers never stopped. The overseer entered the cabin the next morning to record the birth. He stared at the child, scowled, and wrote one word in the ledger under name, unknown. Even before she could walk, she was property, not person. An entry on a balance sheet between a bale of cotton and a new plow. But when he tried to lift her, the baby's small hands gripped his finger so hard that he yelped in pain. He dropped her instantly. They started calling her Goliath's daughter when she was barely old enough to understand what a name meant. She grew faster than anyone had seen before. At 8 years old, she was already taller than most women. By 10, she could carry a bucket of water in each hand without spilling a drop. By 14, she was taller than every man in the field. She didn't talk much, only nodded or looked away, but her silence carried weight, like thunder before a storm. Her world was one of endless fields, the rattle of chains and the rhythm of work songs drifting through the cane. The older slaves watched her with a mixture of awe and dread. Some believed she was a sign that deliverance would come. Others feared she would bring ruin. Children hid behind their mothers when she passed half-scared, half-fascinated. Every Sunday the master, Colonel Wade Harper, would ride past the cabins, inspecting the people as if they were horses. He noticed the giant girl early on. At first he saw potential. She could lift twice what another worker could. But there was more in his eyes, a curiosity that turned slowly into obsession. He started giving her tasks no one else could do, rolling barrels, moving lumber, even wrestling mules to show the guests his miracle of strength. When she reached her full height, 6 feet 8 inches, she was unmissable. The overseers whispered that she must have been born from some unnatural union, that her father couldn't have been a man at all. One called her the devil's child, but to those who worked beside her, she was something else. When she passed, they stood straighter. When she carried a beam by herself, they smiled. For the first time in their lives, the powerful ones looked small. Still, power in that place belonged to Harper. He liked to play God, and in his twisted logic, the stronger she became, the more he needed to remind everyone, including her, who truly ruled the land. Punishment became a kind of spectacle. He would strike her with a whip, testing if she would cry. She never did. Sometimes she would only look at him, her face calm, eyes deep and unreadable. That look made even the other whites uneasy. To survive, she learned to turn her strength inward. When rage built inside her, she used it on the work, digging faster, lifting heavier, enduring longer. Every act of endurance was a small rebellion. Every breath she took was defiance. She knew there was no escape from the plantation's fences, but she also knew that no fence could truly hold her spirit. At night, she sat near the edge of the swamp, listening to the frogs and owls. The water reflected the moonlight across her face, and in those quiet hours she seemed carved from the same ancient strength as the cypress trees around her. She didn't pray to be free, she prayed for the courage to act when the time came. The women who remembered her mother told her stories. Hester had been small and gentle, always humming lullabies in Creole. She died whispering that her child would break the yoke. Whether she meant chains or destiny, no one knew. But the daughter remembered those words. In the silence of the fields, when sweat mixed with dust on her back, the phrase echoed like a drumbeat, break the yoke. Harper's cruelty grew as his fear did. He couldn't understand why she didn't crumble. He boasted to guests that she was his creation, his tamed beast. When he forced her to demonstrate her strength for them, lifting a wooden beam or pulling a cart of stones, she obeyed quietly. Yet beneath that obedience lived a promise that one day she would stop obeying. There were nights when lightning split the sky, and the other workers swore they saw her standing in the storm, rain pouring down her shoulders, eyes turned upward as if speaking to something vast. They began to call her not Goliath's daughter, but the Thunder Woman. Over time, her legend started to travel beyond the plantation. People miles away spoke of the towering woman who could wrestle horses, who broke the overseer's cane with one hand, who never screamed no matter how deep the pain. To some she was myth, to others, salvation made flesh. But inside, she was still that child who had watched her mother die in chains. Every lash, every humiliation pressed against that memory until it became a single point of unbearable pressure. She carried it quietly, waiting. Her silence fooled them all. They mistook it for submission. In truth, it was patience sharpening itself into a blade. The day would come when that blade would strike, and the plantation that once mocked her name would remember it with fear. She had been born in chains, yes, but the fire inside her had been forged from everything those chains tried to crush. She was built by suffering, tempered by endurance, and destined to turn her pain into reckoning. In that sense, the people were right. She wasn't ordinary flesh and blood. She was the echo of every cry buried in the soil, the living strength of those who came before. The overseers called her a monster. The slaves called her deliverance. Both were right, and somewhere, deep in her silence, she knew the truth of her birth. The world had created her to endure what others could not, until the moment came when endurance would no longer be enough. They said she could lift what 2 mules could not. They said she could crack a fence post across her knee. But what truly unsettled people wasn't the strength in her arms. It was the calm in her eyes while she did it. By the time she turned 17, Goliath's daughter had become the most talked-about figure in 3 parishes. The field hands no longer needed overseers to tell them who was coming. They could feel the weight of her footsteps in the earth. When she bent to pick up a barrel of molasses, her muscles moved like coiled rope beneath her skin, effortless and precise. The men who worked beside her stopped boasting about their own labor. They simply watched, half awed, half afraid. Colonel Wade Harper watched too. To him she was both pride and threat. Her power drew his guests' laughter and envy. They called her a miracle of nature, a trophy that proved Harper's dominion over body and soul alike. Yet every time she lifted something no man could move, a flicker of anger crossed his face. He realized that his fortune might buy land, people, and reputation, but it could never buy that. He began to test her limits. One humid afternoon, he ordered her to move an entire timber beam single-handed. She bent her knees, gripped the wood, and hoisted it over her shoulder without a sound. The guests clapped. Harper's smile hardened. He told her to bow. She did not. Instead, she stood motionless, breathing slow, her shadow stretching across the veranda until it reached his boots. For a second, the men went quiet. Then Harper barked a laugh and turned away, pretending he hadn't felt small. After that day, he kept finding new ways to remind her who owned her. He made her work in storms, barefooted, carrying sacks of cotton heavier than a man. When she finished, he found another task, and another. But every morning she returned to the fields, unbroken. The whip left marks on her back that healed quickly. Too quickly, some said, as if her flesh refused to remember pain. The enslaved men whispered that she carried a spirit inside her, something older than the plantation, older even than America. They told stories in the cabins at night, that she had once wrestled an alligator to free a child from its jaws, that she could crush a horseshoe between her palms, that bullets would flatten against her skin like raindrops. The women braided her hair with charms made of swamp reeds, calling her their guardian. The white men, on the other hand, created a different myth. They said she was a freak of nature, proof that black bodies were closer to beasts than to men. They used her strength as entertainment to feed their own arrogance. But deep down, she frightened them because she revealed what they most feared to see, that their power was built on the suffering of others, and that if that suffering ever stood tall enough to fight back, nothing could stop it. One night, a new overseer named Cutler tried to test her. He wagered a silver coin that he could knock her down with one blow. The others gathered to watch. He swung the butt of his rifle into her shoulder. She didn't move. He swung again, harder. The wood cracked before her bones did. The laughter that followed wasn't hers. It was the nervous laughter of men realizing they had just struck something beyond their comprehension. Cutler quit a week later. He told Harper he wouldn't work a field haunted by a giant. Her strength changed the rhythm of the plantation. The overseers shouted less. The punishments grew fewer. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone knew why. Fear had shifted sides. Even Harper's dogs refused to bark when she walked near the house. Birds scattered from the trees above her head. Nature itself seemed to recognize her authority. She used that fear not for cruelty, but for protection. When children were beaten for slowing their work, she would step between them and the lash. The overseers hesitated, uncertain whether to strike her. Most decided not to. They had seen what her hands could do to wood and iron. They could imagine what they might do to bone. But strength, in that world, was never just physical. Her greatest defiance was endurance, the refusal to let pain turn her cruel. She never struck the innocent, never used her power to humiliate. She simply carried the impossible and stayed silent. That silence became a mirror. Every man who looked into it saw the measure of his own weakness. Still, Harper couldn't stop testing her. He began inviting more guests, each time forcing her to perform some new display. He fed his pride with her strength, but each performance fed her hatred. The moment that would end everything began on a summer night when he ordered her to lift a wagon wheel for a crowd of visiting planters. She did. He told her to kneel. She didn't. Instead, she held his gaze until his voice faltered. The onlookers shifted uneasily. A strange tension filled the air. She lowered the wheel, turned, and walked away without permission. From that night, Harper stopped calling her Iron Angel. He started calling her Beast. The punishments grew harsher, the chains heavier, but he could not undo what had happened. The moment his guests saw fear in his eyes, a master could survive hatred, but never humiliation. He began to drink more, muttering about taming her once and for all. And somewhere deep inside, she began to prepare. Strength had been her burden, now it would become her weapon. Every motion in the field, every lift of the arm, every silent breath honed her body for the inevitable reckoning. She didn't plan rebellion in words or meetings. She planned it in muscle and memory. In the heat of each day, when sweat mixed with dust, she remembered her mother's dying whisper, "Break the yoke." Those 3 words guided her through the endless hours until strength no longer felt like a curse. It became a promise. To the men around her, she remained an enigma. To the enslaved, she was hope made flesh. And to Harper, she was the nightmare he had created with his own cruelty, a reminder that no chain can hold what was never meant to kneel. Colonel Wade Harper's fascination with the giant woman began as ownership, and turned into obsession. He had bought her at an auction not for her strength, but for silence. Her refusal to speak intrigued him more than her towering frame. She never begged, never cried, never even looked him in the eye when he called her name. It was as if she lived in a world beyond his command, a place his power could not touch. That silence became a challenge, and challenges were something Harper could not resist. At first, he treated her like a prized beast. He would stand on his porch while guests arrived from neighboring plantations, boasting of his giant. He'd clap his hands and make her demonstrate her strength, lifting crates, bending iron rods, pulling a plow meant for oxen. The men would laugh, the women would gasp, and Harper would smile like a showman feeding his pride. But at night, when the laughter faded and the guests were gone, he would stare at her through the window of his study, a shadow against the moonlight, still working, still silent. Her movements were slow, graceful, almost deliberate. He began to wonder what she thought about as she worked. Did she hate him? Did she even see him? His mind twisted those questions into fantasy. He convinced himself that her silence meant loyalty, that her strength was devotion, not defiance. He began to visit her quarters at night, not to speak, but to watch. Some said they heard him pacing outside her cabin like a restless ghost, whispering to himself. Others said he sat on his porch for hours, staring toward the fields as if waiting for her shadow to appear. The more she ignored him, the more desperate he became to be seen by her. He started sending her small gifts, bits of ribbon, a silver comb, pieces of fruit from the main house. She never touched them. She left them outside, untouched, until the rain washed them away. To him it was rejection, to her it was survival. But to Harper's fragile pride it felt like blasphemy. In that world, a white man could forgive theft, even rebellion, but not indifference. Harper's obsession grew darker. He began dismissing his wife's company at dinner, spending nights drinking alone in his study, staring at her ledger entry, her name written in his own hand, unnamed female, height 6 feet 8 inches, age uncertain. He circled it again and again, the ink bleeding into the page until it looked like a wound. He began to imagine that she was not flesh and blood at all, but some spirit sent to test him. In sermons, he'd hear preachers talk about angels who fell from grace, about devils who hid inside beautiful forms, and he started to believe she was both. His wife, Martha Harper, noticed the change. She saw how his eyes followed the woman, how his temper turned cold when she spoke. The house servants whispered about it too. They said the mistress had burned one of the ribbons he sent, and that the smell of the smoke made him slap her across the face. After that, she stopped interfering. But Harper's obsession no longer needed witnesses. It had its own life now, feeding off the silence between them. He began ordering her to work closer to the house. No more fields. He claimed it was because he trusted her strength, but everyone knew what it really was. He wanted to see her. Every day, every hour. He wanted to watch her move, to control her by proximity. He thought if he could keep her within reach, her power would feel like his. Sometimes, late at night, he'd summon her to the porch for no reason at all. He'd ask meaningless questions. Where she came from, if she remembered her mother, if she had ever believed in God. She never answered. He would laugh softly, saying, "I could make you speak if I wished." She still said nothing. That silence ate at him like rust. He began to drink more heavily. The plantation's ledgers went ignored, the fields grew untended. Even the slaves began to sense that the center of Harper's authority was crumbling. When he walked past, people lowered their heads not out of respect, but to hide their fear of his madness. Then came the night he tried to break her will once and for all. He ordered her into the main hall, where the portraits of his ancestors hung. He stood by the fireplace, the flicker of light turning his face red and wild. On the table lay a Bible and a whip. He told her to kneel before both, before God and before him. She didn't move. He shouted, threatened, and stepped closer, his breath heavy with whiskey. Still she stood. The silence between them grew thick enough to choke. Finally he raised the whip. The sound split the air, but before it could touch her, she caught it. Her hand closed around the leather like it was nothing. Their eyes met for the first time, and in that instant something inside him broke. He saw, for the first time, not a slave but a human being, a woman who had endured everything he could give and remained unbroken. That realization didn't humble him, it enraged him. He yanked the whip, screamed, and struck again, but she caught it once more, and then she turned her back and walked away. No word, no scream, no act of violence, just the sound of her footsteps leaving him behind. That sound followed him for weeks, echoing in his sleep. After that night, Harper's obsession curdled into hatred. He could not bear to see her strength, her silence, her defiance, but he could not destroy her either, because part of him still needed her. Needed to own her, to prove that she had not won. He began isolating himself completely. His wife moved to another wing of the house. The slaves spoke of strange noises from his study, the sound of him talking to no one, cursing the walls, calling her name in the dark. Some swore they saw him kneeling in the yard at midnight, praying for deliverance from the giant devil woman. By the spring of 1836, the plantation was dying. Crops rotted in the fields, workers fled at night. Harper's mind unraveled like old rope, and all the while she remained steady, working, breathing, silent. But silence is never forever, it's only the sound before thunder, and the day would come soon when she would no longer walk away. By the summer of 1836, Martha Harper had become a ghost inside her own home. Once the refined mistress of Harper Plantation, she now moved through the halls like a woman mourning something that hadn't yet died, though in truth it already had. Her husband, Colonel Wade Harper, had become a stranger to her. The man who once quoted scripture over supper now spoke only to the bottle and the shadows. She had watched his obsession consume him, watched his mind twist around the silent woman in the fields, that towering slave who never bowed, never cried, never broke. At first, Martha pitied her. Then she feared her, and finally, she hated her. But her hatred was not for the slave alone. It was for what her husband had become in the woman's presence. Every night she could hear him through the thin walls of their once proud bedroom, pacing, muttering, whispering the name he'd never spoken to her. Sometimes she would wake and find him gone, only to see him at dawn, standing in the fields like a lost pilgrim. She knew where he'd been. The servants' faces told her the truth even when their mouths dared not. There were nights when Martha would sit at her vanity, staring at her reflection in the silver-backed mirror, and whisper to herself, "He has forgotten me. Obraka." But one night, something inside her shifted. She realized it wasn't just that he had forgotten her, he had erased her. And so Martha began to erase him. It started with small things. She dismissed his favorite servant. She stopped sending food to his study. She burned his letters before they reached the post. He didn't notice. He was too far gone, too deep inside his madness. Then came the night she followed him. He had taken his lantern and stumbled out toward the slave quarters. The house was quiet except for the creak of the stairs as she descended, barefoot, holding the hem of her nightgown. The air smelled of rain and decay. She moved through the shadows like a specter, keeping her distance, watching. From behind a row of willow trees, she saw him stop in front of the giant woman's cabin. He didn't go inside. He just stood there, talking to her through the wall, whispering things Martha couldn't hear but could imagine all too well. When he finally turned back toward the house, Martha's heart had hardened into something cold and bright, not grief, not jealousy, purpose. The next morning she began to plan. She called for her old friend, Dr. Samuel Green, a man who'd once courted her before the colonel claimed her hand. The doctor was still smitten, still loyal. She invited him for supper, pouring him wine and speaking in low tones about her husband's mental collapse. He agreed to help. Together, they devised something quiet, invisible, something that could not be traced. Arsenic, he said, a powder so fine it could be stirred into whiskey without changing the taste. A poison that kills slowly, beautifully, like the hand of God closing over the heart. But Martha didn't use it right away. No, she waited. She watched Harper descend further into madness, watched him lash out at his workers, curse at his wife, and collapse in drunken fits of self-pity. He was no longer a man. He was a wound that wouldn't heal. And every day, the silent woman remained the only figure he still seemed to fear or worship. That was when Martha's plan changed. Killing him quietly wasn't enough. She wanted him to know why he was dying. One evening, she sent a messenger to the woman's cabin, summoning her to the main house. The giant came without hesitation, her broad frame filling the doorway like a shadow of judgment. Martha stood by the fireplace, a glass of red wine in her hand, her eyes burning with something between envy and sorrow. "Do you know what you've done to my husband?" she asked. The woman said nothing, of course. She simply looked at her dark eyes calm, unblinking. Martha laughed, bitter and low. "You think silence will save you? It won't. He's dying, you know, slowly. And when he's gone, they'll say it was his own doing. The Lord's justice, perhaps." The woman tilted her head slightly, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. Then she turned to leave. "Wait," Martha said. "Do you ever dream?" Hebrew, the woman stopped but didn't answer. Martha took a step closer. "Because I dream of him burning. I dream of this house burning, and I dream of you standing in the ashes." Still, there was no reply. The woman simply walked out, her footsteps echoing down the hall like thunder. That night, Martha poured the poison into Harper's whiskey. But fate, it seemed, had already chosen its own ending. Before she could serve it, she heard a crash from the study, a sound so violent it shook the glass in the windows. She ran downstairs to find Harper sprawled across the floor, blood pooling beneath his head, the fireplace overturned. And standing above him was the giant slave woman, her massive hands trembling, her face streaked with sweat and soot. The whip lay broken at her feet. For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Martha stepped forward, set the glass of poisoned whiskey on the table, and said softly, "It seems we both got what we wanted. Fabry." The woman said nothing. She simply turned and walked away, leaving footprints of blood behind her. When the sheriff came the next morning, Martha told him the truth, or at least her version of it. She said her husband had fallen in a drunken rage, that the slave woman had tried to stop him, that it was all an accident. No one questioned her. No one ever did. But from that day on, the plantation was cursed by whispers. Servants swore they saw the giant woman walking through the fields at night, her hands still red, her silence heavy as thunder. And in the house, Martha sat by the window each evening, watching the horizon burn orange with sunset, sipping whiskey that no longer needed poison. For she had already killed everything that could die, her husband, her pity, and what little of her soul had survived him. The night the fire came, the air in Georgia hung heavy with the smell of storm and sorrow. The plantation had been silent for days after the colonel's death. Not a song, not a prayer, not a sound from the quarters except the shuffle of bare feet and the whisper of mourning. But silence never lasts long on cursed ground. The overseer, Samuel Boyd, had taken charge in Harper's absence. He was a cruel man who believed in the lash more than the law. With the colonel gone, he ruled by fear, drinking from Harper's decanter, shouting orders from the porch, pretending the plantation still belonged to someone living. But deep down, everyone knew the land no longer belonged to man. It belonged to her. Goliath's daughter had disappeared after that final night. The sheriff searched, hounds were sent through the swamps, and torches burned for miles along the riverbanks, but she was nowhere. The fields were empty, the air too still. The slaves whispered that she had gone into the bayou to speak with the spirits of her ancestors, to ask what came next, and what came next was fire. It began on a moonless night. The overseer was sitting on the veranda, half drunk and half dreaming, when he heard the sound, not of footsteps, but of chains dragging across the dirt road that led to the fields. He stood up, lantern trembling in his hand, and called out into the dark, "Who's there?" Eerie, no answer, only the wind moving through the sugarcane. Then the smell hit him, not smoke, not yet, but something older, like iron and ash. The first blaze appeared on the western edge of the cotton fields, a slow orange glow crawling across the stalks. By the time Boyd reached for his gun, the flames had already split into three. It was as if the earth itself had decided to rise and burn. The slaves awoke to shouts and light. Some ran for water, some for their children, and some just stood and watched as years of labor and pain turned to cinders before their eyes. And in the heart of the chaos, someone saw her. She stood tall in the field, her face lit by firelight, her body a silhouette against the inferno. Goliath's daughter had returned. No one knew how she came back or where she'd been. Her hair was matted with dirt, her dress torn, her hands blackened by soot and blood. But her eyes were calm, almost holy. She didn't run from the fire, she walked through it. The overseer screamed at her, raised his rifle, and fired. The shot echoed once, then again. But she didn't fall. The bullets tore through her dress and vanished into smoke. Some said the fire had made her something more than human, that she was no longer of this world. She walked up the hill toward the mansion, her giant frame cutting through the heat waves. The flames bent around her like wind around stone. And inside the house, Martha Harper watched from her window, the glass glowing red from the heat. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither woman moved. In that silent exchange was everything: the rage, the guilt, the grief, the shared knowledge of what they had done and what they could never undo. Then, without a word, Goliath's daughter lifted her hand and pressed her palm against the front door. The wood burst into flame. By dawn, Harper Plantation was gone. Only ashes and bones remained, and a single chimney standing like a gravestone. The bodies of the overseer and 2 field hands were found near the stables, their faces blackened, their hands clutching their throats as if they'd choked on their own sins. Martha Harper was never seen again. Some said she perished in the fire, her ghost trapped in the ruins, condemned to watch her husband's empire crumble for eternity. Others swore they saw her days later, walking along the swamp's edge, barefoot and covered in soot, whispering prayers to a god who no longer answered. As for the giant woman, no one found her body. The sheriff said no human could have survived that blaze, but the slaves knew better. They told stories for generations about how she walked through the flames unburned, how she became part of the land itself, a protector, a curse, a warning. Farmers who settled near the ruins decades later claimed that nothing would grow there. The soil turned black, the trees twisted, and the birds refused to sing. At night, travelers on the old Harper Road said they could hear chains dragging through the fields and see a tall shadow standing in the embers, watching. One preacher who dared to build a church near the ruins said he found footprints too large to belong to any man. They led from the ashes straight into the swamp, where they disappeared into the mist. They say if you go there on a still night, when the air smells of rain and the moon hides behind clouds, you can hear her humming, a deep, mournful sound that shakes the trees. Some say it's a song of vengeance, others say it's a lullaby for all the souls who never found peace on that cursed land. The legend became a warning whispered through generations of the South: never strike what you cannot kill. Never own what you cannot break, because someday even the quietest hands will rise. And so the story of Goliath's daughters spread, through song, through sermon, through the whispered tales of those who had seen what fire could do to cruelty. Her name was never recorded in history books, but her presence lived on in the fear of the old plantations and the silence of their ruins. For every master who raised a whip, there was the memory of a giant who had crushed her oppressor's skull with her bare hands. For every mansion built on blood, there was a ghostly flame waiting to rise again. And for every scream that had ever gone unheard, there was her, the towering shadow in the smoke, the daughter of wrath and deliverance, walking forever through the burning fields of Georgia. By the time the smoke cleared and the ashes of Harper Plantation cooled, Goliath's daughter had already become more than a woman. She was a story, a warning, a whisper carried by the wind through the pines of Georgia and beyond. People didn't speak her name aloud, not because they'd forgotten it, but because they were afraid she might hear. Weeks after the fire, travelers along the Savannah Road reported strange things. Massive footprints in the mud, far too large to be human, leading into the swamps where no person dared go. Some swore they saw a tall figure standing knee-deep in the water, her reflection flickering in the moonlight. Others heard the low hum of a song, deep and mournful, echoing between the cypress trees. The sheriff who investigated Harper's death resigned within a month. He told the town council that the case wasn't made for men to solve. His hair had turned gray almost overnight. He claimed he'd seen her, standing in the ruins of the plantation house, the flames behind her forming a halo of smoke. Her eyes, he said, weren't angry. They were disappointed. Eerie. The story spread fast. From the backwoods of Georgia to the tobacco fields of Virginia, people began to tell it their own way. Some said she was a vengeful spirit, doomed to haunt the South until every chain was broken. Others said she was a saint, a protector sent by God himself to free the oppressed and punish the wicked. And in a strange way, both versions felt true. The tale changed with every mouth that told it. In one, she crushed her master's skull and vanished into the fire. In another, she rose from the flames and led a caravan of runaway slaves north, her towering form guiding them through the swamps like a pillar of smoke. Some even claimed she still roamed the fields carrying a lantern made from her master's shattered skull, lighting the way for the lost. But the legend wasn't just a ghost story. It was a mirror, a reflection of everything the South tried to bury. Years passed. The Civil War came and went. The plantations fell, the chains rusted, but the fear, that stayed. White families warned their children not to wander near the ruins after dark. They said the giant woman would rise from the swamp to drag them into the mud if they lied or disobeyed. But for the black community, her name was spoken differently. They called her Deliverance. To them, she was not a monster, she was a savior. Her silence was strength. Her vengeance was justice, and her story became something sacred, passed down in hushed voices during nights by the fire. "Don't let them break your spirit," elders would whisper. "Even the quiet ones can bring down empires." By 1880, travelers claimed that on humid summer nights you could still see her, a giant shadow walking through the fog near the ruins, carrying chains that rattled softly, like wind chimes made of sorrow. A local preacher even wrote about her in his sermon notes, calling her the hand of God in the fire. Eerie, but not everyone believed. Historians dismissed it as folklore, a ghost story born from guilt and grief. They said no records of a woman her size existed, no proof of her escape, no evidence of her vengeance. Yet, curiously, not a single farmer dared rebuild on the land where Harper Plantation once stood. One man tried. In 1892, a wealthy merchant from Savannah bought the property, planning to raise a new house on the ruins. On his first night there, he awoke to the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, moving across the porch. The door creaked open, though no wind blew. He claimed he saw the faint outline of a woman's hand, pressed against the window, before his lamp went out. He left the next morning, never came back. The townsfolk said the land belonged to her now, to the woman who burned away her master's cruelty and left nothing but truth in its place. They called it the Giant's Rest. No crops ever grew there again, no birds ever sang, only the sound of the wind, moving like a low hum through the trees. By the early 1900s, photographers and writers came from the north, searching for America's tall ghost. They asked questions in the towns, visited the ruins, took pictures of the old chimney still standing in the overgrown fields. But every time they developed their photos, something strange happened. In the background of the black and white images, barely visible yet impossible to ignore, was a shadow. A towering silhouette of a woman standing in the distance, her head tilted slightly downward, watching. They thought it was a trick of the light. The locals knew better. Over time, her story became part of Southern folklore, whispered alongside tales of hoodoo, crossroads spirits, and haunted bayous. Songs were written about her, though few were ever recorded. One verse, sung in an old plantation dialect, went, "Bree, she walked through fire and didn't fall. Bree, she broke the chains, she broke them all. Silent child of pain and flame, Goliath's daughter has no name." Even in silence, her legend spoke louder than sermons. Her story wasn't just about vengeance. It was about transformation, about how pain could become power and how even the voiceless could shape history in ways no one could erase. Children of freed slaves grew up believing she watched over them, that her spirit lived in the storms that rolled across the southern skies, the thunder her footsteps, the lightning her rage. And when the wind bent the trees, their grandmothers would say, "She's passing by, be still." More than a century later, when civil rights marchers walked the back roads of Georgia, some claimed to feel her presence, a pressure in the air, a shadow beside them, a warmth that wasn't the sun. One woman even swore she saw her reflection in a store window, a tall black figure standing behind her, hands open, eyes burning softly like embers. Legends don't die, they evolve, they wait, hidden beneath the soil, ready to rise again when the world needs them most. And so the name Goliath's daughter became not just a story, but a symbol, a reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks silently through the flames and keeps walking long after the fire has gone out. To this day, if you travel down the old road past the ruins of Harper Plantation, you'll see a handmade sign nailed to a tree. The paint is faded, the words barely visible, but they read, "Eerie, she still walks here." By the time the 20th century rolled around, Goliath's daughter was little more than a ghost story whispered through southern air thick with memory. To most, she was myth, an echo of pain dressed up in folklore. But for one woman, the legend was more than a campfire tale. It was a riddle that begged to be solved. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Price, a historian from Boston University. In 1932, she arrived in Georgia armed with notebooks, curiosity, and a stubborn refusal to believe that the South's most haunting legend could exist without a kernel of truth. She'd spent years studying plantation records, slave narratives, and oral traditions, searching for the places where history blurred into rumor. And something about the giant slave woman of Harper Plantation didn't feel like a rumor at all. The first clue came from a box of old, water-damaged papers found in a courthouse basement in Augusta. Among the brittle ledgers and tax rolls was a single document, a plantation inventory dated May 1829. It listed 47 enslaved individuals by age, sex, and market value. Most entries were short and cold: female, $22, $400, male, $35, $500. But one stood out. Unnamed female, extraordinarily tall, near 7 feet, no price listed. The notation in the margin was even stranger. "Abrahi, unruly, mute, do not sell." Hebrahi Eleanor's pulse quickened. There it was, a shadow of proof. Not a story, not a sermon, but something real enough to have been written by a man who once owned her. Over the following months, Eleanor followed the trail. She dug through plantation deeds, church logs, and family letters belonging to the Harper estate. Most were destroyed in the fire that consumed the plantation, but a few had survived in the archives of a descendant. In a letter from 1830, written by Elias Harper's brother, she found a line that stopped her cold. "Brissa, the giant woman, has vanished. Elias is dead. The house is ash." The rest of the letter spoke of curses, retribution, and the devil's hand. But beneath the hysteria, Eleanor sensed guilt, a man trying to make sense of something he couldn't explain. She spent the next 2 years traveling across Georgia, collecting oral histories from descendants of enslaved families. In tiny towns and isolated cabins, she found fragments of the same story, told differently but with the same heartbeat. A woman taller than any man, silent as stone, who walked through fire and didn't burn. Some said she was a spirit of vengeance. Others swore their ancestors had seen her alive, leading escapees north under cover of night. The deeper Eleanor dug, the clearer it became. The legend was built around a real woman. But who was she? That question haunted her more than any ghost. Then, in 1935, Eleanor stumbled upon a journal in an antique shop outside Savannah. The shopkeeper claimed it came from the belongings of a Harper cousin. Inside, written in spidery handwriting, were entries from 1828 to 1830, the final years before the fire. One passage nearly made Eleanor drop the book. The tall one watches me. Even without a voice, she speaks. Her eyes accuse me in ways words never could. Last night, I dreamed she stood at my bedside and placed her hand on my chest. When I woke, my heart ached where her fingers lay. At the bottom of the page, one sentence was smeared with ink. Abra, if I must name her, I call her Mara. Abra se Mara. A name, a beginning. Eleanor felt an ache deep in her chest as she whispered it aloud. Mara. She began to wonder if Goliath's daughter had been a biblical nickname, a symbol of strength drawn from the legend of David and Goliath, and not her real identity at all. Mara meant bitterness in Hebrew. Perhaps it was a name given to her by Harper himself, an attempt to mock her silence. Or maybe it was a name she chose for herself, one the world had buried under fear and myth. With Mara's name as her key, Eleanor kept digging. She found references to a runaway slave fitting her description in a bounty notice from 1831. A tall female, mute, answers to no name, presumed dangerous, but no capture was ever reported. In the archives of a Quaker safe house in North Carolina, Eleanor uncovered something extraordinary, a record of a mute woman, abnormally tall, who had arrived one night leading 3 escaped slaves. The Quaker who wrote the entry noted, "Obrifer, she did not speak, yet her eyes told every story her lips could not." The record ended abruptly. No one knew where she went after that. But Eleanor believed she'd made it north, perhaps even as far as Pennsylvania, where the Underground Railroad was thriving. She published her findings in 1938 in a paper titled Mara, The Truth Behind the Legend of Goliath's Daughter. Though historians debated her conclusions, her research reignited national fascination with the story. Newspapers called Mara the South's forgotten rebel, and black writers of the Harlem Renaissance hailed her as a symbol of strength and spiritual resilience. Still, Eleanor wasn't done. In her final years, she returned to the ruins of Harper Plantation, now overgrown with vines and moss. Locals warned her not to stay after dark, but she camped there for 3 nights, notebook in hand, listening. In her final journal entry, she wrote, "Abrucher, I came seeking a ghost, but what I found was a woman who refused to vanish. The earth remembers her. The soil hums when the wind blows. They say she had no voice, but I think she spoke louder than anyone in her time. The silence was not absence, it was power." Eleanor Price died in 1942, but her work changed everything. Mara, Goliath's daughter, was no longer a nameless shadow. She had been given back her identity, her humanity, her story. And maybe in some way she had chosen Eleanor to find her, another woman who knew what it meant to fight for truth in a world that often refused to hear it. To this day, historians argue about Mara's existence. Skeptics claim Eleanor was deceived by folklore. Believers point to her research as proof that even buried truths have roots that grow back through time. But in the South, among the old plantations and whispering pines, people still tell her story the same way they did 200 years ago, not as myth, but as memory. Because legends may fade, but names, once spoken again, never truly die. By the time Mara disappeared into the mist of Georgia swamps, the Harper family thought they had survived the wrath of the giant woman. But the plantation's ruins were only the beginning. Shadows, it seemed, were not limited to one night or one act of vengeance. They lingered, they grew, and for the Harper bloodline, The legacy of cruelty and obsession would become a living curse. Elias Harper's only surviving siblings inherited what remained of the estate, a fractured mansion, scorched fields, and an uneasy sense of guilt. They believed the fire had been an accident, a result of their brother's alcoholism and paranoia. Yet in those first months after Mara's disappearance, strange occurrences began to haunt them. Candles flickered without wind. Footsteps echoed in empty halls, horses bolted from stables with no provocation, and dogs refused to enter the pastures that once belonged to her. The first true tragedy struck in 1837, barely a year after the plantation's destruction. Elias's younger brother, Samuel Harper, was found dead in the old stables. His body was contorted unnaturally, as though someone, or something, had forced him into an impossible position. There were no witnesses, no footprints except his own, and the only clue was a deep gouge across the floorboards, shaped roughly like a human hand. Locals whispered that Mara had returned, not as a woman, but as a force of retribution, punishing the Harper bloodline for generations. As the years passed, the Harper descendants faced a series of inexplicable misfortunes. Business ventures collapsed overnight. Ships sank at sea without record. Fires consumed houses. Every Harper, it seemed, carried a mark, a whisper of Mara's judgment that followed them wherever they went. By the 1850s, the family was a shadow of its former wealth, scattered across Georgia, South Carolina, and beyond. Each member living under the specter of a vengeance they could neither understand nor escape. The superstition grew. Servants who had stayed loyal to the family began to leave, saying they could feel the giant woman watching in the nights when no one else dared venture outside. Churchgoers avoided the ruins of the old plantation, claiming that evil lingered in the soil itself. The land, they said, had absorbed Mara's wrath, and nothing human could cleanse it. One particular story, retold in hushed tones by the descendants themselves, captured the essence of the curse. In 1862, during the height of the Civil War, a Harper heiress named Louisa was traveling to Savannah to deliver supplies to Confederate soldiers. Her carriage broke down near the old plantation ruins. As she walked across the field to find help, she claimed she felt an enormous presence beside her, tall, silent, watching. Panicked, she ran, only to find herself collapsing into a ditch filled with snakes, the horses running off into the fog. She survived, but the incident left her terrified, her mind haunted by visions of a giant woman standing over her. Louisa's descendants would later describe similar hallucinations and nightmares, all echoing the same warning: the Harper family could not outrun the past. Even those who tried to deny it could not escape the pattern. Heirs who tried to sell off land from the plantation reported their crops dying mysteriously. Families who built homes near the ruins experienced inexplicable illnesses and sudden deaths. Horses went lame, chickens perished, and servants quit in terror. There was no natural explanation, just a persistent belief that Mara's power had seeped into the land itself, leaving a curse that lingered long after her disappearance. By the turn of the 20th century, the Harper name had become a cautionary tale in Georgia. Historians and folklorists documented the series of misfortunes attributed to the family, linking them back to Mara. They speculated that the giant woman had left a permanent mark not on individuals, but on the bloodline itself, a warning that cruelty, obsession, and abuse of power could reverberate for generations. Yet, in this darkness, there was also a strange sense of justice. Scholars who examined the records noted that every misfortune fell disproportionately on those who had perpetuated cruelty or sought to exploit others. The descendants who tried to live lives of humility, generosity, or justice often prospered quietly. The curse, it seemed, was not indiscriminate. It punished evil and rewarded virtue, much like Mara herself might have intended. Even into modern times, the Harper bloodline carries whispers of this legacy. Tourists visiting Georgia occasionally hear stories of old Harper estates haunted by a silent figure walking in the mist. Genealogists who trace the family tree discover strange deaths, sudden disappearances, and uncanny luck that cannot be explained by natural causes. The curse became part of the folklore fabric of the South, a story passed down to teach future generations that injustice and cruelty leave marks far deeper than scars on flesh. For Mara, the curse was her final act of authority. She had vanished from the world, yet her influence remained, a silent reminder that no master, no matter how powerful, could ever break the human spirit without consequence. The Harper bloodline endured, but not unscathed. They were haunted by her memory, by the pain they had inflicted, and by the undeniable truth that power built on fear invites retribution. By studying Mara's legend, historians, writers, and storytellers began to understand that her story was more than the tale of a giant woman. It was a narrative of justice, endurance, and moral reckoning. Her silence, her strength, her vengeance, all were lessons embedded into the land, the family, and the culture of the South itself. Even today, when the wind moves through the cypress trees near the ruins of the old Harper Plantation, locals swear they can feel her presence. The giant shadow moves silently among the smoke of memory, reminding all who dare to listen that some curses are more than superstition. They are echoes of history that cannot be erased. The Harper bloodline remains a warning across time. Those who wield cruelty will face consequences far beyond what they can imagine, and the ghosts of the past have a way of reaching forward, reshaping the future, and teaching the living the price of their sins. Decades after the fire that consumed Harper Plantation and the legendary appearance of Mara, Goliath's daughter, whispers of her presence persisted among locals, travelers, and those with a penchant for the supernatural. Unlike the official records or historian accounts, these were stories passed through memory and mouth, witness accounts that blurred the line between reality and myth, and cemented Mara as both a spectral figure and a moral symbol. The earliest post-fire accounts came from those who had been children at the time of the blaze. One elderly man, Thomas Whitaker, recounted to Eleanor Price in 1933 that he had been 8 years old when he saw her for the first time. He described the scene vividly, a silhouette towering above the ruins, hands blackened by smoke, moving with an unnatural grace through the remnants of Harper Plantation. According to him, the giant woman didn't seem angry. She seemed deliberate, like a force of nature meting out long-delayed justice. "I didn't understand what I was seeing," Whitaker said, his voice trembling. "She just stood there, taller than anyone I had ever seen, staring at the house. I swear I felt her eyes on me for hours after, even when I was back in bed." Others offered similar tales. A freedman named Elijah Brown, decades later, recalled a summer night in the 1840s when he and a few companions were navigating the swampy terrain near the plantation ruins. They heard low, deliberate footsteps on dry earth, although no one else was in sight. When they turned toward the sound, they saw her, Mara, silent, colossal, and moving with measured purpose through the mist. She walked like the earth belonged to her, Brown said. Even the crickets and frogs seemed to pause as she went by. None of us spoke. None of us moved. She vanished into the fog before morning, and I have never forgotten it. Travelers, surveyors, and hunters who passed through the area contributed their own experiences. One account described a man lost during a storm, seeking shelter in the abandoned fields. He claimed to see a giant shadow appear in the lightning flashes, and though she did not speak, the figure seemed to guide him toward safety. Others swore they heard her humming a deep, haunting tune, a melody that carried both warning and comfort, sorrow and power. Some witnesses recounted terrifying experiences. A family attempting to rebuild the plantation reported seeing Mara standing near their home at midnight. They claimed that as she moved closer, their horses panicked, doors slammed shut, and the youngest child fell ill immediately afterward. Though skeptics dismissed these stories as folklore, the consistency of detail, her immense height, silence, and calm yet commanding presence gave them a weight that mere imagination could not explain. Interestingly, not all accounts depicted her as malevolent. Many interpreted her as a guardian, a protector of those who had been oppressed. During the early years of the Underground Railroad, several witnesses swore that Mara guided escaping slaves through the swamps at night. She did not speak, but her movements indicated paths, warning of dangers, and even scaring away patrols. Some historians suggest that this role transformed her from mere avenger to symbolic heroine in African American folklore. The stories continued well into the 20th century. An early 1900s journalist documented multiple claims of a towering woman appearing near the ruins, always silent, always observant. Each report shared common characteristics: extraordinary height, immense strength, quiet demeanor, and a presence that evoked awe and fear. Whether seen through the mist, the flicker of candlelight, or lightning flashes, Mara's image remained remarkably consistent across decades and narrators. Folklorists also noted that these accounts served a purpose beyond mere storytelling. They reinforced cultural memory and imparted moral lessons. Cruelty and oppression do not go unpunished. The powerless can rise. Silence can be more formidable than speech. Mara's legend became both an oral history and a tool for teaching the next generation. Elders recounted her story not only to entertain but to warn children of the consequences of cruelty and injustice, embedding her presence into the very fabric of Southern storytelling. Even in modern times, people visiting the old Harper Plantation site claim to have felt Mara's lingering presence. Photographers report unexplained shadows in the background of images, while hikers describe the feeling of being watched by something enormous, silent, and deliberate. While skeptics attribute these experiences to natural phenomena or the imagination, the sheer volume of reports over nearly a century suggests that Mara's legacy extends beyond folklore, persisting in human consciousness as an archetype of vengeance and justice. These witness accounts also reveal the duality of Mara's legend. She was terrifying to those who had perpetuated cruelty and comforting to those oppressed. Her silence was a canvas upon which individuals projected their fears and hopes. To the Harper descendants, she remained a symbol of punishment. To the freed slaves and marginalized communities, she was an emblem of deliverance. Mara's figure, both human and mythic, became a lens through which morality, power, and memory intertwined. By collating these accounts, historians and folklorists argue that Mara's story cannot be dismissed as mere legend. The convergence of independent reports, spanning generations, suggests a shared cultural memory that transcends imagination. Each witness, regardless of their background, encountered the same figure, towering, silent, formidable, and carrying the weight of historical justice. Even today, the ruins of Harper Plantation are visited not only by tourists but by researchers seeking traces of Mara. They study eyewitness testimonies, photograph the ruins, and explore the swamps, hoping to reconcile the tangible remains of history with the spectral presence described for decades. The legend continues to inspire writers, filmmakers, and artists, blending horror, history, and morality into a narrative that refuses to fade. Mara's silent journey through time is a testament to the power of memory and the human need to seek justice, even posthumously. Witness accounts, carefully documented, demonstrate that some legends are grounded in shared experience, persisting across centuries, guiding, warning, and inspiring all who encounter them. The tale of Goliath's daughter, therefore, lives not only in history books or folklore collections, but in the memories of those who have seen, felt, or imagined her presence, a testament to the enduring impact of a woman who refused to be silent, who walked through fire, and whose shadow continues to stretch across the southern landscape. By the early decades of the 20th century, Goliath's daughter, once a terrifying presence in the ruins of Harper Plantation, had become something far more enduring, a legend that transcended the boundaries of time, geography, and culture. Mara, the giant slave woman who had crushed her master and walked unburned through fire, evolved from an avenger of the oppressed into a symbol of justice, resilience, and moral reckoning. Her story, passed down through oral histories, folklore, and later historical research, became a touchstone for discussions about power, vengeance, and survival in the American South. The endurance of her legend is in part due to the meticulous work of historians like Dr. Eleanor Price, who unearthed her name and pieced together the fragments of her life from dusty archives, letters, and eyewitness accounts. Yet even without academic validation, Mara persisted in cultural memory. The stories told in the early 1800s to freed slaves, passed from parent to child, remained vivid in the minds of those who had experienced the trauma of slavery firsthand. They spoke of a giant figure who intervened when humans could not, who exacted justice with silence and strength, and who became a spiritual guardian for those denied freedom. Artists, writers, and later filmmakers drew inspiration from Mara's story, transforming her into a mythic figure that could confront moral ambiguity in storytelling. Novels and short stories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries began to feature female characters of extraordinary strength, often silent, who rose against oppression. Folklorists documented the consistent attributes of Mara's legend: immense height, a silent demeanor, unmatched strength, and the ability to traverse fire or shadow without harm. These motifs became recurring archetypes in Southern Gothic literature and cultural narratives, influencing works that explored justice, revenge, and the supernatural. One significant aspect of her legacy is her symbolic power in African American culture. Mara was more than a cautionary tale; she became a symbol of empowerment and resilience. For descendants of enslaved people, her story reinforced the idea that strength, intelligence, and courage could manifest even in the most marginalized and oppressed individuals. She became a beacon, a figure who acted when the law and society had failed, embodying the moral truth that cruelty and injustice always carry consequences. The Harper bloodline's documented misfortunes, long attributed to Mara's curse, also reinforced her influence on the collective imagination. Every disaster, illness, or unexplained tragedy that befell her oppressors became a narrative reinforcement of the legend, embedding it further into local history. For the community, her story was a living moral compass. It validated the suffering of the oppressed and warned the powerful that acts of cruelty, particularly against those without voice or recourse, could not go unpunished. Even in the modern era, Mara's presence is felt in discussions of historical memory and social justice. Documentaries, podcasts, and historical reenactments have brought her story to new audiences, emphasizing the intersection of folklore and historical truth. Scholars note that her legend serves as a lens to examine the realities of slavery, gender-based oppression, and racial injustice, offering a narrative through which people can engage with the painful past while honoring those who resisted in extraordinary ways. Her legend has also shaped local tourism and cultural preservation. The ruins of Harper Plantation, the swamps she was said to haunt, and the surrounding areas have become sites of historical interest. Visitors are drawn not only to the story of destruction and vengeance, but also to the narrative of moral consequence, the reminder that history is alive in the land, in the memory of communities, and in the stories that refuse to fade. Interestingly, Mara's silence, her defining characteristic, has been interpreted in multiple ways over time. Some see it as the ultimate form of empowerment, a refusal to be silenced by oppression while allowing actions to speak louder than words. Others interpret it as a representation of the voicelessness of the enslaved, whose resistance and courage were often hidden from the historical record. Through this dual symbolism, Mara bridges myth and reality, transforming a historical figure into a cultural archetype that continues to inspire reflection, art, and scholarship. In literature and popular media, Mara's influence is visible in the portrayal of strong, silent female protagonists who rise against oppression. From Southern Gothic novels to contemporary films exploring historical injustices, her essence, immense strength, moral clarity, and quiet power, echoes across genres. This enduring presence demonstrates the universality of her story, a narrative of justice, courage, and resilience that resonates across time and place. Furthermore, her story contributes to the broader understanding of how legends function in society. Mara's tale exemplifies the intersection of folklore, history, and morality. It illustrates how communities create narratives that preserve collective memory, enforce ethical lessons, and transform traumatic experiences into shared wisdom. Mara's legend thus serves both as a historical case study and a cultural artifact, bridging the gap between fact and narrative, memory and morality. The symbolic resonance of Mara extends into contemporary social discourse as well. Discussions of systemic injustice, gender violence, and racial oppression often draw upon historical figures who resisted in extraordinary ways. Mara represents a powerful example of resistance, a figure who acted decisively, imposed consequences, and inspired future generations. Her story emphasizes that courage and moral clarity can manifest in actions rather than words, and that justice can be exacted even when formal systems fail. Today, her legacy is preserved in oral histories, academic research, literature, and local storytelling traditions. It serves as a reminder that the echoes of the past are never fully silent, that acts of cruelty leave traces long after the perpetrators are gone, and that resistance, whether visible or silent, can inspire generations. Mara, the giant silent woman of Harper Plantation, continues to walk through the collective imagination, her story a testament to the enduring power of courage, justice, and memory. In conclusion, the enduring legacy of Goliath's daughter is multifaceted. She is remembered as a force of vengeance, a symbol of empowerment, a moral arbiter, and a cultural icon. Her tale intertwines historical reality with folklore, illuminating the experiences of the oppressed while warning the powerful of the consequences of cruelty. Mara's silence, strength, and actions resonate across centuries, ensuring that she is never forgotten, and that her story continues to shape understanding, culture, and memory. Her name, her legend, and her deeds have become immortal, demonstrating that some stories are too powerful to fade, too vital to be silenced, and too just to be ignored. Mara's shadow still walks, guiding, warning, and reminding the world of the price of injustice, and the enduring power of the human spirit.